And then after I undertook to do this, he asked me to throw in some other things about our family. So it took a little time to get going. And I'm sorry about the snow last month. I was going to do it then. But here I am. And don't bother interrupting me if you got any questions. And these are just memories and what I've been told, and some of it might be a little bit wrong. And Glenn, he's in the back, and he's a little older than 2 years beyond me, so some of his recollections will probably be better. But anyway, now Tom, this is a picture. See, our family, my grandfather Claude Reinhardt and my grandmother Winnie moved to Guemes in 1925, and that's when our family got here. But I started out with a picture of the Elk II, which is one of the earlier ferries on Guemes. There's the Wooten House, and the reason I can get a little emotional about this, but see, my wife, I married her in 10 days, it's 49 years. Tell me to shut up if I talk too much. But anyway, here's the history of that. Grandma Agnes, where Dawn and I got married in Seattle, she was a Seattle gal, and her father was one of the early King County prosecutors, and he died of a heart attack in Portland. And Agnes had 2 sisters and a mom, and they moved to Anacortes in about 1906 or 7. And Agnes's mother started living, I don't know if they ever got married, but she lived with the gentleman that built this Guemes Ferry. And his name was Mr. C.C. Kiesling, and he had a boat works in Anacortes, and he employed like 20 to 25, what do you call them, boat rights or whatever. What do they call them, Win?
That's close enough.
Yeah.
Okay. But anyway, so he built that boat, and you can, if you'll flip the picture, I think that one is, this is my wife's grandmother, and this is a picture in Anacortes, and this is Mr. Kiesling, the boat builder, and so they live somewhere near Cap Santa, and of course, after I got into the family, I got to know Agnes had lived in Anacortes, and she told me about growing up here, and she had Wally Funk, who had all the pictures of the county. Well, Wally's mother was one of her teachers at the old Columbian School in Anacortes. So actually my wife's contact with Guemes is a little predates ours, and Agnes used to come over on the ferry from the Cap Santa area to Guemes Island. So I wanted you to know that. And that's a picture of him. Now he took the family ultimately to, he left Anacortes for some reason and went to Wrangell, Alaska, and then Agnes, I think, got through high school there. And of course I had been a fisherman in Alaska, and when I found out about that, I had to talk to her about Wrangell, and I asked her if she knew maybe any of you folks been there. But there's Chief Shakes Island. It's a ceremonial thing for the Tlingit Indians. And so I asked Agnes about that, and she said, "Oh yes, we used to go over there when she was with this, living with this man as her, not stepfather, but father-in-law, or whatever you want to call it."
Is that Kiesling?
That's Mr. Kiesling. But he would take the family over to Shakes Island, Chief Shakes Island, every week, and get what she called a hogshead of water. That was so that, for their living. So she knew all of it. But anyway, I just wanted you to know that. Now, this is North Beach of Guemes. About the time my grandparents arrived there in 1925. Now this was a gravel road, and this was the old barn, and Glenn and Arn Veal and my brother and Butch Krieger even, we used to open doors on both ends to make light in there so we could play basketball. We had a hoop or two up there. And it was, you know, it was kind of, you could be playing up there and you just didn't want to fall out that door. If you got any questions, ask me, but I was a little late learning how to ride a bicycle. I know Glenn and Arn, they probably learned how to ride a bike a year or half a year before me. And my dad he bought me a bike from Sears, and there was a closer road to the beach, which didn't have any gravel on it. And my dad took me down there and said, there, you practice on that road, because if you fell over, you were on moss. And that's where I learned how to ride a bike. But now, my grandparents, as I recall it, see, this was the tractor shed. Now, this before my grandparents had it. No, excuse me, that was not this was the garage. They kept a car in there. When my grandfather got here, he put a windmill on it, and he's charged an automobile. Yeah, there's solar power back then, wind power, but he charged an automobile battery and he had some lines that went up to the house, so he had a little bit of electricity before electricity on the island.
What years was that, roughly?
Well, he probably put that in like about 1928 on top of this, and when that windmill was up there, even still when I was in grade school, and then it you know, it got dilapidated, and he also had, so that was the garage, and this was what we called the granary, and there was an old combine in it. Glenn probably remembers that in there, and we didn't go in that too much. We hung around the garage more, and this, I recall this as being bigger. It had an open door and he had some implements in there. But in the barn here, he'd installed a carbide pressure system where he dumped carbide and put water in it and then clamp it down, and it would generate acetylene gas. And he had piped that up to the house too, so that he had that as a lighting system. That was.
Was
now,
that a dairy farm?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay,
that's
sorry.
good.
Gotcha.
Now, and it wasn't much of a dairy farm. No, I don't think he ever had. No, that's Claude. I don't think he ever had more than 4 or 5 dairy cows. And you know, in all of the time that I knew him, he died the year after Dawn and I were married. He died in 1971. But in all of the time I knew him, and my recollection, I never recall him ever having a job, and nor my grandmother. And now, Buzz milked the cows. Now, back there, you told me, I'm having trouble with names now.
Well,
Steve.
we used to
Yeah.
we used to buy.
Stuart Charles, yeah.
We used to buy milk
Yeah.
from Reinhardt's in the summer.
Yeah.
That's where we
Right.
got our milk, we got our eggs from Schultz.
Yeah,
And
well,
those were all
see,
dirt roads too.
but I never got to learn how to milk cows. I know Glenn and Arn Veal did, because they had them up at their farm. But every time I would get there, my uncle, he's 10 years older than me, he'd be in there milking, Buzz, Uncle Buzz, and he'd say, come on over here, and I'll teach you how. So I'd walk over, and then he'd squirt me. and then, no, come on over here, I'll do it again. And he was, like I was 4 or 3, and he would, yeah, come on over here, every time I get down there. But I never got close to that. Now this, the granary, actually, some of you folks might remember Gail Brado on the. Well, Gail Brado built the store down there where the North Wind Art Studio is now. When he built that store down there, my dad either gave him or sold, but they moved that granary down behind the store, and it's built into that big structure right now. So, now, and also, when I was a kid, now that, see, it could be that he moved this over, there was a bulldozer shed here. My grandfather had a gas-powered John Deere bulldozer without a blade on it, you know, and he orchestrated a lot of work. I never really saw him run it, it was always Buzz. No, that's just the way it was. I never quite figured that out. But anyway, that was the bulldozer shed. And any other questions about that?
Well, did he maintain those roads with his bulldozer?
No, he didn't have a
These
blade. No, that was just a Lee Lewis down the road.
That's a problem.
He was the road grader at that time. Yeah, those were all dirt roads, yeah.
Our Uncle Dick Stapp used to row down to where the dairy cows were, and then would carry the milk up the beach and sell it for
Oh,
13 cents.
Yeah, that's-
Deliver it for 13
well,
cents.
that's
or
before
something.
me. I'll tell you
Yeah.
about some milk at Tubbs a little later, when I get to Buzzville. Well, yeah, and so this is,
Yeah.
this is before my grandparents arrived, because my grandfather either tore that house down or it was gone. And then the current house that's there would sit in front of that house. Now, I never saw this, I never saw any of that. And these are the buildings I talked about. But, you know, about this, now, I'll tell you about this picture. Most of you, longtime people, you remember when Linda Porter died.
Yeah.
Okay, now, you were there, and I was barbecuing salmon, and, you know, you guys, you people that have been around here a long time probably remember Whitey Stuber. He was the milk truck driver, McDougal Wagner, and like Glenn, I know you remember him because in the summer, the Vonnegut kids and my brother and I, and Glenn and Arn, and there were the Peterson boys over in the valley, and we'd always be around with a nickel or a dime in our pocket because Whitey Stuber would come along with the milk, and we wanted a Dixie cup for an ice cream cone. And Whitey we'd be all there, and you kids come around here, and then he'd open the thing and God, I thought I put some, and you know, every day, where did I put those? No, he did that for 3 or 4, you know, when we were all young. So I knew him, and I worked with him in the cannery later. But anyway, about 2 years after Linda's funeral, and I had talked to him over there, because he was there. Linda grew up as a neighbor of Whitey and Whitey's daughter. And anyway, about 2 years after that funeral, Whitey came into my office, and he just said, "Hey, bud, tell me about the Rogers family on North Beach, Guemes." And I never heard of them. And it turned out that Whitey Stuber's wife had a grandmother who owned this place just a few years before my grandparents came in. And so he stopped back, and he gave me this book, and I'm going to give it to the Historical Society. There's some information in here about Bud Strong's family, and also about Don and Helene Taylor. They were his wife was related to Don and Helene Taylor. So I wanted you to have that. But anyway, Whitey told me about that, and he actually told me that his wife's grandmother died right there before my grandparents came along. So any other questions about that, let me know.
What about those little sheds in the picture, or those little goat sheds?
Right here?
Mm-hmm.
Those were gone by the time I recall. My grandmother had, right around here, she kept her spices outside. She had like an old wooden refrigerator. And, you know, you see these spices now and you're supposed to throw them away in 6 months or 2 years. Well, my grandma had spices out there that had been out there for 20 years. So but that, whatever it would be right around in here. So you can flip it on. Now this is my grandmother, Winnie, and Claude, and my mother. And this is her brother, and he was, I don't know who took this photo, but he was quite a photographer. You'll see some more pictures, but my granny grew up in Toronto and Cuba. She lived half-time in Cuba and half-time in Toronto. And how she ever, she came from kind of a wealthy family. There might be a picture coming up. Her father had the ownership of the Dominion Piano Company in Toronto. It wasn't that big a deal, but anyway, but every year she got to be in Cuba and Toronto. And my grandfather, he was, I don't know too much, but he was born in Denver, and he and his, I don't know anything about his mother, but his father took him to Alaska, and he was only about 7 or 8 years old, and there was a barroom gun shooting, a shootout in Valdez, Alaska, and his father got killed. It was a drunken brawl over a woman, I guess.
He was
Well, that
7.
happens in Alaska. But anyway, he got shipped home somehow. You know, that Valdez to Seattle in those years was, I don't know what the trip was, but I assume it was by boat. And he ended up in an orphanage in Seattle for quite a while. And then he was in the military in the First World War. I have his discharge paper. I think he got out as a corporal. And then I don't know much about him, but he told me one time that he worked in the oil fields in California and in Texas for 3 years straight without a day off. And I think that's when he came to Guemes, and he never worked another day. That's really true. Now, and this was Winnie's brother, and he was about 17 years older, and he was a photographer. And anyway, that's an early. This is right down in front of where that little shack is that I built the year that my mom died. That little brown shack down there.
What was your mom's nickname?
Giggy.
Good,
Yeah.
okay, I got it now.
Yeah, that's all the, you know, like Ski Wooten, whatever.
Yeah,
Hi,
yeah,
Giggy.
yeah.
And actually Earl Cahill called her that too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my family.
Anyway, this is my mother, and this is the house that he put in. Now, mom and dad, her mom and dad. This is the house there, still there, and it was a Sears Roebuck house. No, he bought it for about $900. No, in pieces and added a cent. I'm sure he had it assembled. But anyway, that's early pictures of North Beach. When I was a kid, he had planted other trees here, and actually there was a deodora cedar that it's a very aromatic. It's like from the Himalayan region, and the top blew off of it, and we had when I was after Dawn and I moved to the island, the top blew off. My mom was living there, and I had Bill Welch come along, and he sawed it and fell it, and then Arn Veal came along and picked it up and made cedar boards that are on the outside of my pump house, Dawn's pump house. And Dawn's father helped me put the siding on that, but that wood came from my grandfather putting in an aromatic cedar long ago.
What kind of car is that?
Pardon?
What kind of car?
Oh, I don't know. Glenn, you know,
Old.
that's way ahead of me. Yeah. That's just another image of, see, that was a shed that was by that bigger house. I never saw that house. That was gone when I was a kid. When I was growing up, there was a pear tree on the east side of the house there. And this, she kept her chickens. She had, you know, wild chickens back there, but that never was there in my life, no.
Is that the McEachran farm barn?
That would be, yeah, up here would be, that's where the eagle, you know, the eagles are still.
Yeah.
But he had some other kinds of trees in there. He had some, oh gosh, those are the ones that had all the, every time you touched it, you got hawthorn trees. He had some of those. And there was like a white birch tree in there. It was a nice yard long ago. But anyway, there's another picture of that. Or are we going the wrong direction?
I hope not.
You got to get through with this. Now, any questions? Anybody? I
So
don't
the
know.
road at this, when this picture was taken, did the road go down to the beach and continue up to Lewis?
Oh, yeah, it went up to where you are. Sure. Yeah, the gravel road did, but like I said, there was one earlier that was
On
along.
the beach, kind
Yeah,
of.
it was a very soft, gentle road, and that's.
Yeah, yeah,
What the
oh,
bike-
where you did the bike, yeah.
Now this is my Uncle Buzz. And
Yeah.
this, Uncle Buzz was just 10 years older than me. He was really a fun guy. All his life, he really was. And this was his second wife. She's still alive. She was actually 12 years older than he was when they got married in '63. And she lives in Seattle. Now, I was going to say something else about, but I'll give you more about Buzz. But he just died 3 years ago. Well, about 3.5 years ago. And just 3 months ago, we finally got around to putting we brought his ashes up. She came up with, he has 2 surviving children, and he had his grandchildren there, and we took him down with, it's emotional, but there was his ashes, and we took some clamshells and threw some of it in the bay there, and then took 2/3 of it up to the cemetery. Yeah, so he's up there, close to George Humboldt. He's up in the the south, upper part of the south, and George Humboldt is up there, and then my grandparents Reinhardt are up there, but it took us 3 years to get buried. So I'll tell you more about Buzz. And now that I've been talking about my grandparents Reinhardt, but this is my father in about 1945, and this is at Spiden Island. Now don't ask me how but see my dad and my mother and my brother Lee, I wasn't here yet. I might have been created over there. I might have been. But see, in about the war was over, and my other grandparents were in Minnesota. That's George. They lived right across the street. They both died in 1959. She had a heart attack, and then 6 months later, he was fatally injured in a car wreck. Somebody crossed the center line and got him. But so they were both in their later 60s, and that was the end of them in '59. But anyway, in about 1944, when the war was still going on, my dad's sister in Minnesota was giving birth to a 3rd child and died. It was one of she was only 25. And at that time, see, my dad's parents were in Minnesota too. And so they, in time, not too much time, they grabbed my cousins, Kay and Rodney, who were my dad's sister's, you know, little children that were there. And my grandparents brought them out to this area. And that was right after the war was over, I guess they brought them out here. And of course, my dad was here because he was stationed in the military at Whidbey Island. He was on those PBY planes, you know, those amphibious flying gas cans. But anyway, so that's how he met my mom in that era. But anyway, the other grandparents came out to be with my dad with their two grandchildren. And how they ended up on Spiden Island, my grandparents did, the grandparents Ashbachs, and my dad and my mom and Lee, and then my two cousins. And they were over there for like maybe a year. And I don't know but I don't know how they ran into that job. But the guy that owns Spiden Island at that time was a machinist. He ran a machine shop in Seattle. His name was Sulak. And he was convinced in the war that Seattle was going to be bombed. That's what and so he sold out and moved to Spiden Island. And if you've been by Spiden Island, on the southeast end of the island, there's like an aluminum shed. Well, that was built there by that guy near the tail end of World War II. And for some reason, my dad and my grandfather worked over there for a while. And that only lasted about a year. And then they came back to Anacortes, Guemes area. And Mr. Sulak owned it. He owned that property he owned Spiden Island until I was in college in Bellingham. And he sold the island at that time for $675,000. And then it became Safari Island with the wild animals. And that was a lot of money in 1967. But then some years later, whoever bought it from Mr. Sulak sold it to the Oakley Sunglass, you know, but, pardon? And they paid $20 million.
Oh my God.
But anyway, but I didn't, I might hail from the island, but I wasn't there.
What's going on with this picture?
Well, I don't know what that is. I don't know what he was doing. No.
I was wondering if it might be something, he's on a little raft there, I thought maybe it might be a cable,
I don't know.
cables to get him across the bay or something.
I don't know what it was. Yeah, sorry, but now you can flip another picture. So this is on Spiden Island with my grandfather and this is Rodney and Kay. And Rodney still lives in,
That's your grandfather Ashbach.
yeah, this is George Ashbach. At one time, you historians, you may not know it, but at one time there were 4 Georges between the ferry dock. And my grandfather, there was George Kingston, there was George Pineo, there was George Humboldt, and George Ashbach, all alive between the ferry dock and right across the road here. And he was one of them. But, this is Kay. She lives in Florida now, and he still lives in Kansas. But that was some of what they did on Spiden Island. And this is up a kitty corner from the old playground or the school, where Glenn and Janice lived there. And my you remember, and then we took over before I went to law school. But this is that place, right up at the crossroads that Mike Hardy now owns, and this is me, Lee, and my cousins. And because my grandparents owned that for a couple years.
Well, Mike Hardy lives.
Yeah,
Mike
Hardy.
Yeah, this was.
Oh.
Yeah, this was the old house that's not there, but it had cardboard walls. My grandfather put cardboard balls in it. Yeah,
I
well, you had to
remember
work
that.
We remember
Anyway.
that.
And this is, now this is North Beach, yeah, that's Grandpa Claude, my grandmother Inga,
Stewart to the north.
and my mom and my dad. And I guess that's Lee and me and Rodney and Kay. But, yeah, this is, that was Claude. And, yeah, he wore sunglasses a lot.
Oakley? Well,
Now, this is, this will get to Buzz.
Okay.
Now, when Buzz turned about 15, my parents bought it. This is where Mike Stamper lives now. That's where we were. That's where I, anyway, but my parents, when Uncle Buzz got to be about 15, well, they bought him a Model A with the rumble seat. And of course, he had an Anacortes sticker on it, and that's me and Lee. And I'll tell you, this was a fun thing, but here about Uncle Buzz, one hot summer day, my mom had been doing laundry, and she had clothes out to dry, and Uncle Buzz, he was, see, I was born in 46, he was born in 36, and my mom was born in 26. So he's right in the middle, and he knows my mom's doing this laundry, and and this was gravel road, so here, and not this day, but one day he came by, and he was running back and forth just for a long time, just running up a cloud of dust. And my mom was, hey, knock. And Buzz was laughing and honking, running back and forth. And here's where we get to those milk cartons, or cans. At that time, my dad had some pigs, and we were raising them there. And so he was running back and forth, and I, being a little kid, you know, I was 10 years, I was probably maybe only 5 and a half. So I go over one of those cans, which got the curdled slop in there. And it looked, you know, at that time it was like a big ball, but I was just a little kid. But I got one and I hid, there was a little rock wall there, and I hid there. And here comes Buzz zooming, and I pitched that thing up, and man, it splattered right on my nose. Don't forget, it just, bam, like that, and he slammed on his brakes. And he got out and chased me around, and there was a little shed down where we used to raise, we raised pigs, and that is down here, it's gone now, but I remember climbing up on that. I was going to get up on the roof, and he couldn't get me. But Buzz got a hold of me, and everybody's laughing, and I was laughing, and he said, all right, you know, and he drugged me over to that can of pig slop, and he said, you're going to eat some of that now. And he made me eat some, and we were laughing about it, but he did stop. He didn't do any more of that. That was the end of him. Making the dust that day. But that was Buzz. That was the kind of, he was always fun. Like he was always kidding, and I'll tell you some more about him. But oh, that's me.
Look at that.
Skinny little kid. I don't know where that was, but that was about, I was about 7 or 8. And I was shivering. Anyway,
looks like got
with
enough to eat.
there's Uncle Buzz, about the time he would have been in high school, yeah. He was a good-looking kid, and like, you asked me to talk about him. One of my first memories of Buzz, I was only about 4 years old, and it was like a Saturday, and my mom took me down to the house at North Beach there. And he was playing cards on a card table. He was just sitting there, and I'm 4 years old, and I'm just fascinated, and he's playing cards. And he finally looks at me and he says, looks like you kind of want to learn a little bit about cards. And I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, he said, let's, how about teaching you about 52 card pickup? No, and I said, well, yeah. And so he sits in his job. He said, all right, pick him up. He went down, here, got him down, pick him up. But he was like, I was only 4 years old, and then he was always like, all right, let's bet on that. Heads I win, tails you lose. And I fell for that. So anyway, you can,
Is that what somebody would wear at the high school?
well, I go back.
They can't, is that casual wear or?
I don't know. Another thing about Buzzville, I can tell, now this actually happened. I was probably 6 or 7. I was on the school bus, and Buzz brought, now that was when senior Cliff Weigel was the bus driver. Glenn, you remember Cliff and Bessie. Steve, you do. And Cliff was the bus driver, and one day, Buzz brought home a brand new 30-30 rifle on the bus. No, this was like it would be like 65 years ago. And Buzz, and Cliff was very interested in it. And he opened it up, there the school bus driver is, and he wanted everybody to see that, and Cliff said, that's a marvelous weapon, you'll enjoy that your whole life. And he brought it, that happened now, you can't do that now. Anyway, that actually happened. Now this, Glenn, you remember this. That's you, Glenn, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is Mike Brantley and Sharon Brantley. That's probably Gary, isn't it, Glenn?
Yeah.
And that's Lee and Orrin and me, and the Veals had this. It was like a Gravely or one of those old, and it was hooked up to a cart, and it ran around the area up by the Veal farm now. They're still doing it. Yeah. When, if you want a picture of that, we'll get you one.
Yeah, I remember that.
Mike Brantley and Sharon lived on a house that, a two-story house that was right across the street and maybe just a little bit to the north of where Mike Quast is now. And the Brantleys, Mike and Sharon, their parents were Olin and Ruth. And Olin he worked on the state ferries. They ultimately moved to Linwood, and Olin and Ruth, of course, are both deceased. Sharon lives in Lake Stevens area. She was here for one of the class reunions that was 12 or 15 years ago. I don't know what happened to Mike. But the Brantleys, Olin Brantley had a brother, and some of you, Olin Brantley's brother was Newby Odell Brantley, who invented 3 helicopters. And you can look them up on the computer. But he was a very industrious man, and at one time was like the Pilots Association Pilot of the Year. But he developed. The first helicopter he developed was a counter. It had one rotor going this way and the other one going like that. And then he built a 2-seater of Brantley, and then he built a 5-seater that had problems with ground resonance shaking. But anyway, he was actually, Odell Brantley was the guy who actually invented the backhoe. That was Olin Brantley's brother. And Olin was our neighbor for a long time. So that's some of Guemes too. The inventor lived in Oklahoma. Yeah, that's my Uncle Buzz too. And I remember another thing about that Model A. He took Lee and I to the show one night, either the Empire or what, there were two shows in Anacortes, and that was when the ferry dock was down at, you know, that end of town. And he took us down with his Model A, and then we came back on like the 11 o'clock ferry, and by God, he couldn't, it had a dead battery. But he had the crank. And he was out there, and he tried for 20 minutes to get it. And I was sitting there, Frank turned the crank, but he couldn't get it started. So we had to walk, Lee and I, with Buzz, we walked all the way from the ferry dock on the gravel road to North Beach. And we got there, and the grandparents said, well, what took you so long? And Glenn will remember this, Steve Orsini probably, Jack Schiller's pond up there on Section Avenue. It's pretty much overgrown now, but all of the local, there were not too many, there really weren't that many girls on the island, were there, Glenn? There was a few.
Until the Daniels girls.
Yeah, there were those, and then, but it was mostly guys. And anyway, that was the swimming pool. Now that's getting away from history.
But that was also the site of some of the greatest hockey games that
Oh,
Guemes
in the
had.
wintertime, yeah.
Yeah, in winter, yeah.
Now, and Jack Schiller, I think somebody asked me why that pond was there. Well, Jack, he raised hay there too, and he irrigated, remember Glenn? And then he would get 2 crops, and then of course the pond would go down. Jack dug that with his own bulldozer. Jack was an industrious guy. He helped build Ralph Stockton's house, and I think he helped Colonel Vonnegut build the Tower House up there. And yeah, he owned a lot of property on Guemes. His wife was Dorothy, and they were neighbors to the north of us on Section Street. And they would get out, they'd be working together, and they'd just be yelling at each other, but they would always just laugh about it. No,
So is that at Fitzgerald's? Is that what you would say?
I didn't hear that.
That pond, you say that's at Fitzgerald's?
Yeah, but it's really overgrown, and it's not, anyway, this is Uncle Buzz and I. I first went north in 1964. Glenn and Arn went north that year too. And anyway, Bob Porter took this picture. We're leaving Anacortes, this Cap Santa, and this was, I remember the day, it was June 25th, 1964. So that's the day we took off for Southeast Alaska. And Junior Seaman was the skipper. Uncle Buzz was on there, and there was Uncle Buzz, there were 6 of us, and I was 17, and there were 3 crew members that were 27, and I kept thinking, God, those people are really old. I'll never be that. No, and the skipper was 34, and the cook was 65, and actually, after Buzz and I were the last 2 surviving, and so I'm the only guy left alive on that crew.
What happened to that? That's a beautiful boat. What happened to it?
Well, it was built in Anacortes.
Huh?
It was built by either E.J. Kidder or his father, and there was a boat building yard in Anacortes. It was a nice boat, but it never was really finished. It didn't have much of a galley, but it was a nice boat, and it had a nice Caterpillar V8 engine in it. And I don't really know what happened. That's the only year I was on that boat. Susan Ann was, I told you it was Mr. Kidder that built it. Well, Susan Ann was Susan Ann Kidder, who was a classmate of mine in high school. He built it when Susan Ann was just a little toddler. I think it was it would have been his granddaughter. But Buzz was the engineer on that boat that year. And I was in the skiff with Ron McCary.
Is that a purse seiner?
Yeah. the net was probably, it was in the hull for the trip to Ketchikan, and the power block was down on the deck here. That was, the power block is the apparatus here that your net would go through after you got the heavy weight lines over the side of the boat. Glenn knows about that too.
That's the boat I went north on the first time, the Suzanne. And
You were on what?
on this boat.
What year did you go north?
1970, the summer of 70 was the first summer.
Oh,
that I
okay,
went
well,
in. And it was run by Les Senf
oh,
and Bruce, who was on board my.
was Les running the Susan Ann that year?
Yeah,
Well, the
no, it
year,
wasn't 70.
66 or
Sorry.
64. No, 66.
I'm off by about 4 years. It would have been about 68.
Les, the year I was on that, Les Simp was running the Dora R.
Okay,
That was a metal boat
Right.
that had,
Round portholes.
but the house was extended out here on both sides, so that this upper house went out to the same this way out as the bulwarks. And the problem with that was it would, with the piers, it would rock like that, and that would damage that part of the Dora R. So a couple of years later, it was shortened. You know what I'm talking about, when? And that 1964, Les Simp was running the Dora R, which was a metal boat, and I had two high school classmates. I had Brian Fayette, he graduated with me, and also Norman Osborne. They were both with Les Simp in 1964. And Les was a real good guy. His wife worked at the Harbor Restaurant first. She was very nice. Anyway, that was, this junior seaman is the guy that actually taught me. I was 17, but he actually taught me how to work. No, he was a very good, very nice skipper, and his saying was, when we're not fishing, be prepared to fish. And when you're fishing, you work, and then when you're prepared to fish and you're not fishing, then have fun. That was his life. Sorry. And this is Winnie and Grandpa Claude. I don't know, it was her birthday, but she lived to be about 83. He died in 1971. I'll tell you about that. And she died right before our son Brian was born. So she died a little over 39 years ago. But and Claude, he told me that all he ever wanted to live to was 77 years. And I don't know what he knew about the Bible. Now, we got people here that do know, but he always said that 77 years was a biblical lifetime. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but when he got to be 77, about a year earlier, he had, am I taking too long?
No, you take as much time as you
But
want.
about a year earlier, he had appendicitis, and that was, he survived that. But Dawn and I it was right around Thanksgiving that he died, and we were going over to her uncle's place at Ritzville. That was Gilbert White. Dawn's aunt was married to Gilbert, and he had a 3,000-acre ranch about 12 miles north of Ritzville on Crab Creek. So we were going over there for a family outing with her cousins and her parents, but anyway, Claude was in the hospital, and it didn't appear to be grave, but we stopped by. That was when Anacortes Hospital was kind of little, and we stopped by just to say we're going to Ritzville for Thanksgiving and have a good time. And I said, now, Grandpa, when are you thinking of getting out of here? And his answer was, Bud, I'm ready to go at any time. And he died within a day. No, And I don't think he was really sick, he just said, I'm. No, he didn't make any bones about it. And this is my grandmother, a picture taken by her brother at Cuba. And now, I can't say for sure, but we still have a saddle that her family had in Cuba. Don refurbished it about, what, 3 or 4 years ago? And see, Buzz lived for a long time in Mukilteo, but about 20 years ago, he got sick of the Everett traffic and packed up and moved to Ephrata. And once in a while, I would get a case over in Grant County or somewhere around there, and I'd always stop by and say hi to Buzz. And as he, maybe 10, 11 years ago, he started saying that the doctors over there said that he's got dementia. And so I would just, you know, I would almost look to get a case over there so I could go over and see him once or twice a year. And so Dawn was looking at that old saddle that my mother had, and that we still have. And so I walked, saw him and knocked on the door, and I said, "Hey Buzz, tell me about that old saddle that was around the farm." And he said, "Oh, let me tell you about that. That was made in Cuba." And he said, Bill Beesner that used to run the ferries, Buzz, and he's, you know, this is after he'd been told he got dementia and all that. And he said, Bill Beesner always used to borrow that saddle from us when he went hunting because it fit him. And Buzz said he liked, a cantle on a saddle is that back part of the, but Buzz was using all these technical terms, and he knew quite a bit about it. And actually, I don't think he had dementia. He had, like, he just refused to, like the cars that you start without a key, he just couldn't figure, how do you do, what are you talking about? You got a car without a key. And he would, and the doctors would, because he didn't know anything about computers, and he'd say, well, he'd tell the doc, well, do you know how to tune up, do you know how to change the injectors on a diesel? Anyway, that's a picture of my granny earlier on in Cuba. And so she, like I say, she married down to Claude. And like I said, this was her father's company. But so it wasn't that big of an event, but you can look it up on the computer, and they also made picture frames. But this is in the Toronto area, and this is her brother. About 2 years ago, I just stumbled on a bunch of, and he had taken this picture. It's just a fascinating picture of, you know, going from Manhattan to Staten Island, looking back at antique Manhattan. I thought it was just I saw that and I said, wait a second, I gotta have a picture of that. But that's what he took. And then there's Claude Run. That's as close as he probably ever got to a cow. No, Buzz milked him. Squirt. He never, I don't think he ever squirted Lee.
Oh, no.
Lee was probably too smart for it. There she is in Cuba. But anyway, see, I don't know exactly how she and my grandpa got married in California, I guess. They got remarried again later in life. We have the newspaper clipping of when they got married in California, and then we have the certificate of when they got married in about 1968. But that's what went on.
They renewed their vows. Are those apples?
Now, Uncle Buzz, let me look out here. Yeah, we're all elderly people. But now, Dawn and I, it's not related to this picture, but you wanted me to tell you some stories about Buzz. Now, when Dawn and I left the island in the fall of '72 when we went to Spokane when I started law school, and we came back the summer of '73. My dad had died that winter, but we came back in 1973, and I was fishing with Del Cole that summer, Del on the radio. I fished with him 1973 and '74. He was a wonderful guy. Let me remind me to tell you a little bit about it. But anyway, behind my mom's house there's a little shack. It's just about 70 feet behind the house. Well, when my mom and Buzz grew up with my grandparents at the house being small, that shack was out behind where my brother's little cabin is now. But it's been moved around. But in 1973, Dawn and I came out of Spokane, and we really didn't have any place to live. And so we took we went up to the old shack, and my mom had a trailer, little low-liner trailer, and we slept in the low-liner trailer next to the shack. But you remember this? And we went in, and it was Buzz's and my mom's shack. See, after my mom got married, then Buzz moved out there, and when I was a kid, that's what, if you wanted to talk to Buzz in his bedroom, you'd go out and talk to him in his shack. And so, and it was full of all kinds of stuff. And but anyway, this summer of '73, we're out there, and it had cardboard walls. You remember this? And we cleaned it all out. You want me to shut up? We cleaned it. No, there was old used Roman candles in there, and used fountains, and just a bunch of junk. But we were tearing off the cardboard, and we found two those little metal containers that condoms used to be in. They were empty. They were tucked up behind a piece of cardboard. And so I said, well, look at this. And Dawn and I, we were laughing about it, but they were metal. And just like the size of bear.
Were they Peacock brand?
There was a Sheik and a Trojan. A free pack of each that were empty. No, and so like that, and I knew Buzz and Jean. You saw their pictures. They were coming up like the next weekend. So I go like that, and we cleaned the place up and painted it, and that was our day room. But Buzz and Jean came up. And we were talking. We were at the table there, and Mom had cooked a meal, and so and Jean is there. She's a very lovely lady, and they had already been married, like 20-some years at that point. And anyway. So Buzz said, "Well, what's going on up there?" And I said, "Well, it's really interesting." I said, when we found a couple of things we thought you'd like to have that. And we're all eating there, and he said, "What's that?" I pulled him out, and I said, "Well, here." And he looked, and he said, "Those belong to your mother." But he put them, and he would never give them back. But that was
So you're saying we don't have them for the Historical Society?
yeah, no, he would never give them back. And then now that was '73. You can move another picture, but Uncle Buzz, see, that's her. But in 1973 and 1974, see, he was fishing with Nick Boykovich on the Pacific Castle. And I was fishing with Del Cole on the radio, and Del, I agreed with Del. Del wouldn't allow booze on the boat. Crew, you couldn't have booze till you got to town. Don't bring the booze around the boat. And we were fishing side by side out at Iceberg Point with the Pacific Castle and my uncle on Nick Boykovich's boat. So on a hot August day, we'd be fishing within, 200 feet out there. And Buzz would always grab a beer about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he would drink it silhouetting himself. And then he'd look at me. No, he would just rub it in like that. But booze on a boat, Glenn knows it. Steve, you would know it. I fished with Buzz on the Christie in 1971 with Johnny Hook Surian, who he grew up in Anacortes. He was a very smart fisherman, and he knew I was interested in going to law school in 1971. But he was the skipper on the Christie, and we were fishing sockeye down in front of the Edmonds Ferry Dock. That was the year that the Cedar River sockeye run was allowed to be. That was the one that the professor of the University of Washington Fisheries, he got the run started, and that was 71, that was enough of a run that it got opened up down there, and we went down and fished. And Hook and Buzz both liked their boats. And we were in a fast purse. That's where the winch is really going like that to pull in the, Glenn, you know I know what Glenn knows what it is. But you're bringing in the first line on a purse seiner real fast. And Hook was waltzing around there on the hatch cover. I was running the winch, and so I was closer to the galley where the control is. And my uncle was running the outside close to the hatch cover, and they'd been boozing. And Hook, a very intelligent guy, he came up and he got his rain gear in the winch. And I saw it. And I bam like that. And it took him down, and it broke his shoulder. And and that's booze on a boat, I tell you. And he looked at me and he said, "Bud, thank you." Another half second, I'd have been hamburger. And I said, "Well, I knew that." And he lived 20 or so more years, and he would come up to North Beach of Guemes in the summertime because Franny Barcott, Steve, you might remember Franny, he was a seiner.
Yeah.
You got a question? But anyway, Hook they were friends, so he would come up about every summer for 20 years, and he was always unusually cordial to Don and I. And I never had a bad. I knew him for a long time before 1971. He was always very generous to me, but that happened, and that's why I agreed with Del Cole. There's no boots on the boat. So, and then Del Cole.
Did he change his ways?
Pardon?
Did the guy who got hurt in the winch, did he stop drinking on the boat?
I don't think he skippered too much longer. He was a very intelligent guy. I could give you a whole lecture on that, but he would, anyway, that has nothing to do with my grandma other than my uncle. Yeah. Oh, and that's Don and I.
Look at that.
That's Don and I the day we got married, which was the first day of spring in 1970, and that was at Grandma Agnes's house in Seattle. I can't remember. It was on 15th Northeast, just near Kim's Auto Rebuild. But people know where that was. And that was after a little bit of champagne. Anyway.
Yeah.
We all get older.
Settle.
And that's the last of the photos.
Oh, is that it?
That's it.
Okay, now, you can shut that one down, but now,
I think I'll leave that.
Are there any questions about what I've said? Now, let me tell you,
So how long have you and Dawn lived on the island?
Well, we lived, after we got married, we lived here until we left in August of 1972 for law school. And then when I got out of law school, we were here briefly, and then we moved to Tacoma because I started working in Olympia with the then insurance commissioner, who let me tell you about Glenn. I'll get to you. Do you any?
What?
You want me to shut up?
No.
Oh, wait, no. This actually.
I don't know what you're saying.
This,
Tell me.
how many of you folks,
I don't know.
you know, you guys are as antique as I am.
Not
But
quite.
anyway, before Dawn and I went to law school, of course, we were broke all the way through law school. Let me tell you about Del Cole. But before we went to law school, we would go to the Skagit County Fair and have fun because you could do it for a couple bucks. Well, we're there in the summer of 1972, and we're walking through these animal buildings, and we see these, maybe some of you guys remember these. I've got one at home, but it says no smoking by order of Carl Herman, the insurance commissioner. Any of you guys remember those?
Oh, yeah.
Does anybody?
Oh, yeah.
Where no smoking appeared smaller than Carl Herman. No, well, anyway, Dawn and I we're going through the fair over there, and we're seeing all these Carl Herman no smoking signs. And we're, now what kind of personality would, what's the mentality of a politician that would do that? So we moved to Spokane, and on day 2 of law school, I bumped into a guy that became my, actually, one of my 2 or 3 best friends through law school, and that was Chuck Herman, whose father was Carl Herman. And so I came, and you know, and that was right after Bobby Fischer and Spassky had played chess. So Chuck and I were playing chess. We were about equal. And so when I came home and I said, Dawn, you will never guess who I met. And you know, it was Carl Herman, and Carl Herman's son. And Chuck was very friendly, and he had horses, and we had one before we left. So we got to know him. And within about 3 or 4 weeks, we actually met the commissioner. And he was very gracious. And so we got to know what that mentality was. And then of course, I would see the commissioner all through law school because he had an office in Spokane, and he would, you know, dilly-dally between Spokane and Olympia. And then when I got out of law school, he put me on the staff at Olympia. As an investigator for the Office of the Insurance Commissioner, and that was the year that the Herman-Gordon litigation was going on up at Watergate West. And if we'd have won the election, I was going to be a deputy insurance commissioner, but we lost the election, which is a very good blessing in disguise. But anyway, that's a little bit about. Did I give you enough info on that story? No, Glenn, you had a question.
Well, no, I just wanted to add to your story back when you were showing the pictures of the barn, how we used to play basketball up there. And we used to have some pretty good games, and that you reminded me when I was mentioning it to you that we were playing with Butch Krieger that one time.
Yeah.
You tell the story.
Well, there was a little dry rot in that floor, and he kind of punched a little, but he didn't fall through. But so when you were playing basketball, you had to go around that area.
Butch was a little heavier than the rest of it.
Yeah. Now let me about Buzz. Now I'll answer any. Now Del Cole though. I was telling you about.
I have a question. What's the, I never did get clear the different spellings of Ashbach.
Well, I was telling the
Yeah,
gentleman
yeah.
here, right here,
Right.
Mr. Prescott.
You're right.
Well, Gene, most of you probably don't, you don't remember Gene. Gene died, that was Agnes's husband, and he died in about 1986. '87, because I was working in Linwood that year. And you called me, Don, and said you had a stroke. And, but they had been on the island some few years. We called Agnes Aunt Agnes, but she was married to Gene, who was one of my father's cousins. And they were both educators. He'd been a principal down in Portland. And they spelled their name Ashback. And of course ours is H, but they were cousins. And they hadn't been on, Gene and Agnes hadn't been on the island too long. And Dawn and I were at the community club. And I was talking to Gene, just like this, you know. And somebody walked up and said, "Hey, you guys spell your name differently. What about that?" And I looked at whoever it was and I said, well, we insisted on that before he came to the island. He really didn't see any. He didn't see any humor in that. But he was actually a fun guy. That was unbelievable.
So part two, Ashbach is a region or a little township in Austria, right?
That I don't know.
Been there.
No.
It
Okay.
was spelled with an
No,
H.
it's probably a P. It's probably a P.
Because
BAC.
No.
Ashbach. Ashbach.
If you can just picture that Susan Ann boat that Bob Porter took the picture of. Now here's Buzz again. See, Junior ran the crew. There was 6. The cook didn't run wheel watch. He didn't. The skipper didn't. So there were 4 of us. There was my uncle and me, and there was Ron McCary and Mel Casbaum. Those 3 were all 27. And on wheel watch, I was stuck with Ron McCary, and he was a fine guy. He died 7, 8 years ago. And Buzz was with Mel Casbaum. And this is the way Buzz worked. Like, he knew there was going to be a time zone difference. And see, it was 6 on and 6 off. So Buzz figured it to where when we got up to the time zone, anyway, we had to stand wheel watch 7 hours. And he only had to do it 5 hours. And he was laughing about that. And then, let's see, other stories about my well, and I don't mean to be scatterbrained, but when I showed you a picture of the house that my grandfather built from Sears, and I told you about my grandma had chickens out behind, and see, again, when I was pretty young, and I mentioned the pear tree, well, my grandma would tell me to go out and collect some eggs, you know, and of course Buzz would be, he'd know that would be coming, and he had a little bench up on that pear tree. And he had a pop gun that would shoot ping pong balls. So he would situate himself up there, so that when I went out to get the eggs, he'd be, yeah, that was Buzz. And, just a funny guy. And okay, and then his first marriage was to Nancy Valquist. Some of you folks remember Con Valquist and Marie. Well, Con Valquist's brother was Phil Valquist, who had a place over where Dave and Duane now. That's where Phil, he was quite a fisherman. He was always winning salmon derbies. But he had a daughter, Nancy, that Buzz married, and they had 3 children, but that marriage didn't last. But I remember I was at they got married down in Seattle, and Ski Wooten was there, and I remember that. But anyway, Buzz bought shortly thereafter, he bought one of those 1959 Chryslers. And it was a fancy, it wasn't no good, but it was a fancy one. But my older brother Lee, at that time, was learning how to drive. And Buzz was, at that time, working at Wyman's Marina over here by the hatch cover, where Dan Crooks runs the boat launch that comes to Guemes when the very, anyway, Buzz was working there, and he was showing Lee how to drive that Chrysler. And Lee backed it up, and unknown to Buzz, dented the tank, the gas tank. And Buzz found out that when the car was running with when it was running with like a quarter of a tank of gas, it was really empty. And he messed up the gauge, my brother Lee did. And Buzz was saying he ended up selling that car, and he sure bet that somebody had trouble with that gas tank. that was Buzz. And let's see. Now, Buzz, no, I don't, I'm not speaking disparagingly of him at all. He, you know, in about, he was a real drunk skunk. No, he would, down in Everett, there was a restaurant on, now I'm telling you the truth, and he learned it, but on Broadway, and he'd be down there at 9 o'clock in the morning drinking bourbon. And that went on for a long time. And one time he went, they had to take him to the hospital, and he found out that the doctor, you know, described him as just a drunk. And he called me, and I went down there, and he wanted to sue the doctor. And I said, there's a little bit of truth here. And Buzz, and about a year later, he quit. He quit. And see, I didn't have a drinking problem. I didn't run. But myself, I quit drinking on June 14th, 1985. That was a weekend at Melita and the Beals, and Dawn and I and all of the kids went to Darnell's over at Lake Shanann. And on the way over, up by Marble Mount, I bought one of those little tiny beers, and I said to myself, that's the last one. I didn't announce it, and I quit. That was the last day I ever had any alcohol. And after about a month, Dawn said, hey, you haven't had a drink or what? I said, no, I quit. And Dawn said, well, we'll see. But anyway.
Well, I hadn't noticed.
Didn't make any difference.
But anyway, Uncle Buzz continued to drink, quite a bit of time. And then in the spring of 1999, I bought a little bulldozer. And I was building a shed for it. That's that one that's right along the road. There's some motorcycles, and then there's a bulldozer in the lane too. Well, anyway, not to bore you, but Buzz came up from Everett, or he might have been in Freda, but he came up to see my wife, or my mom, excuse me, and he was interested. He wanted to see what the bulldozer looked like, because, you know, he had run the old bulldozer on the farm, and he came up, and I was putting some boards on, and he said, this is the way Buzz talked. He said, well, I hear you haven't had a drink now for about 13 years. I said, yep. And he said, well, let me tell you something. He said, I haven't had a drink now for 3 years, and I've been sober for 1. I was so drunk, but it took me 2 years to sober. No, in his life, he never had another drink. So, and he quit smoking, and actually, it was but when he went to Freda, he took up religion too. And I said, you want me to quit talking? Well, that was Buzz.
So that was your dad's brother?
That was my mom's brother.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but he was always, you want me to quit talking? But Buzz Buzz, see, when everybody said he had dementia, I was telling him about fishing for crab, and I made these buoys that looked like kelp, so that people wouldn't, you know, the boats would go by and there's just kelp. It wouldn't be a crab pot where they. And so I was
All
telling-
legal, all legal.
No, I
I said all legal. You were legal.
Oh, well, no, don't worry about that. But it was about these jackpots that were out at Jack Island with kelp buoys. And he's, you know, he's supposedly dementia, and he could walk out there. He didn't say it that way. He was a little bit of swearing in it. But, I want some of those crab. He still knew what was going on. And, now, I'll quit, but I mentioned Del Cole on the dry boat when Buzz was silhouetting, and Del he was a principal guy. Glenn, you fished with him, I know.
Yep.
And he was a wonderful guy. He had a reputation of being ornery, but he was not. He was very generous to his crew. And Dawn and I were in our 3rd year of law school, and we were about broke. There was about 2 months left of law school, and I was getting ready to go down there. We didn't borrow any money. No, we didn't. And I was going to go down and borrow a little bit of money. And one day, I walked home from classes, and there was a note from Del Cole. And you see, the prior summer, before the rest of the crew showed up, I worked on the boat with him for 2 weeks over at the shipyard. And he was a wonderful guy, and I just liked being around him. So there was there was work to be done, and he and I did it. And so about 2 months before law school was out, I come home, and by golly, there's a card from Del Cole, and there's a check in it for $800. No, and he said, but I always meant to send you some money for that 2 weeks, and here it is. And so Don and I didn't have to borrow money to get to law school. And that night we went out to the old spaghetti factory. You tell me if I missed anything.
That's good.
Thank you, Bud. We'll go round 2 later on.
Round 2. That was great.
Well, it's recorded.
No, about more Buzz stuff.
Didn't he live on Guemes?
Well, he lived on Guemes until about the time he got married to Nancy. He was, but there's some time in there I can't really answer. But after he married Nancy, he lived on Fidalgo Island. They went out. They lived out by the Fidalgo School for a while, and then they bought up as you go up 32nd, and then you turn towards Park Lake Road. They had a house up there too for a while, and then that marriage didn't last. But, then he was down around Everett, and then he met Gene, and then Gene and Buzz had one boy. That's Nick, my other cousin, and he's a blacksmith. He's a very good blacksmith. Yes, he is. He's very busy and talented guy. So there you have it.
Wow, that's